I guess just the other day I looked at the title that I had sent to Eric and I said, how on earth can I talk about this in like 10 or 15 minutes? So I only have like 4 or 5 slides to show, and there's a lot of anxiety in the room. I can feel it. It's about these huge data sets that have already been collected. We all have them. I've got them. My desk is littered with them. It's anxiety inducing. What I thought I would do is I would instead focus on a project that I am going to do for which there is no data yet, which is kind of makes me feel light on my feet. It's kind of exciting. And I guess the main point that I want to make with this is that when we want to talk about something like geographic variation, what we need to do is we need to think about the acoustic structure, what we're looking at acoustically, as a phenotypic trait. It's a trait of the organism. And so therefore, if we want to understand something like the evolution of geographic variation within a species or even divergence between species, then we need to understand what are the biological processes that underlie the generation of the acoustic phenotype. And so I'm going to show you a specific example of an acoustic phenotype, a bird singing, but it's not just any old bird singing, as you'll see in a moment. And then I want to ponder what are the biological factors that drive that phenotype. And then when we look at those factors together, then we can think about how variations in those can lead to divergence in the signals. And so, so I've been working for a lot of years on birds. I've had 14 field seasons in Galapagos, looking at Darwin's finches. I'm closer to home in Massachusetts. We're working on local species of sparrows, and I had a student working on warblers. And we're interested in all sorts of things. We've done some hand-rearing studies where we raise baby birds and we train them with songs and we look at the development of their songs. It's really fun. I'm at a transition point in my career. I just gave up the directorship of our graduate program. And so I was really needing a sabbatical. And I'm going on sabbatical in September. And so I'm very excited about that. I got a fellowship to do this. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be spending a year in the city of Manaus in Brazil. And I have an old friend there who's actually from Massachusetts, but now he's the curator of birds at the the National Institute of Amazon Research, INPA, in Manaus, which is where Pedro Rivo got his PhD, by the way. And my friend there, Mario Cohn-Haft, he has been involved in trying to build up the collection of bird specimens at this institute. And he's very interested in eco-geography and conservation. And the main bird specimen museum there, collection, was very poor before Mario started. And so he's really interested in documenting diversity, and there's a lot of really cool stuff that's going on with that. Anyway, he's been involved in various expeditions. He loves Google Maps, and he looks for places in the Amazon. He's the world's expert on Amazon birds. He's been trying to find places that have been understudied, and he goes to look at them. And he's been on this kick. So when we think about the Amazon rainforest, you tend to think about it as mainly lowland. But in northern Brazil, sort of north of the Rio Negro, there are these weird features. Occasionally there are these sort of mountains that just pop up, these isolated mountains in the middle of nowhere. And so he's made some expeditions, led some expeditions, and they've gotten a lot of coverage and press coverage in Brazil. Anyway, last year he came back from one of these expeditions and he wrote me, he said, "Jeff, you will not believe what's going on here." So he had managed to get incredible footage and recordings and collections of a kind of bird that is very poorly studied. So you guys might have heard of the group of birds called manakins, which are very well known for their crazy displays. They have all these bouncing, jumping, dancing displays and all these really great vocalizations. Rick Prum in particular has been a person that's pushed that forward. In that group, that's the group of birds called cotingas. There are some other birds that are not really dancers, they're more vocalizers. And in that group, there's a group called the bellbirds. And they're called bellbirds because they make these incredibly conch sounds. They sound like bells. And they're super loud. And I've had the pleasure of hearing them. And all throughout Central America, South America, you can hear them. But normally you hear them from very far away. Anyway, he was up on this mountainside. And they got eye to eye with some of these bellbirds. And so I want to show you a video that was taken by his buddy Anselmo, who's a photographer, a pretty amazing photographer. We think that this is maybe the loudest bird in the world. It's so you can't really capture the sound on audio, but if you hear a bellbird, it's usually that thing. You know, you see it off in the distance, this little speck, and they're really blaring away. Let me see if we can get this to work here. It's got this really cool waddle too as well. You see the camera shook there when it sang for a moment. It's like a clang of a gong or something. And just check out the posture on that bird. The bird is not just sitting there doing nothing to get that sound. It's really blasting away. So it's a sort of beautiful acoustic event. And you can just record it, and you can look at the song, but I think it's really meaningful to see where that came from, and to see the animal. There's another video clip that's the same bird, but it's got two song types. The second song type's a little bit different, and posturally it's quite different. Isn't that cool? That bird is cool, and he knows it too. So this is a white bellbird, and like other birds in the group Cotinga, they communicate. It's the males that come together to display in these leks. These guys have what we call exploded leks. The males are quite far away from each other. They're probably communicating with each other. There's another one far away from them. Anyway, so Mario, they got these videos, and then they collected a specimen of one of these birds, which, you don't really want to kill them, but occasionally one or two for a collection can be very valuable. And as they were doing the dissection, Mario said, I just can't believe it. I'm going to show you the pictures. I didn't put them in here, but basically the abdomen on these birds is different than what you would ever see in a normal bird. There's a muscular wall that's thickened to the point where the ribs are embedded inside the abdomen. And when you look at that, you can't help but think that that's somehow related to the acoustics of sound production. That this bird, in order to crank out this high volume sound, it almost fills itself up with air like a frog does. In order to do that, there must be some morphological specialization that allows for that, and vice versa. Once you have the morphological specialization, it allows you to achieve the certain acoustic output. So anyway, just look at that bird. It's like straight out of Pixar, right? Look at the throat filled with air, and the beak is just cranked open. And these and I'm sure the syrinx is modified. We want to take a look at some of this as well. Anyhow, so if you think about an acoustic event, because that's what it is. It's a verb. It's something that happened. And with bioacoustics, we capture the output, the byproduct of something that had just happened. And I think it's really important to think about that from a biological perspective. So factors that affect the vocal phenotype. And I came up with a dozen. This was last night after, I'm sorry to admit that, after a difficult plane ride. So what affects the structure of the sound? Well, it's the mechanics of signal production. A leafhopper would not be able to produce that. That's sort of obvious. Why? Because you have to have a certain vocal. In this case, it's a phonation mechanism. So a lot of vertebrates can do this, where they're breathing out, and that's able to cause some mechanism, some structure, labia or membranes to vibrate, which can produce the sound. In this case, the case of the bellbird, to get it cranked out with such high amplitude, you got to have certain pressure built up, and there's got to be some other adaptations in there. The structure of the signal can also be affected. Now we're not talking about bellbirds specifically. It could be about any creature that makes sound by indirect selection on morphology. So this is actually a major thing we've been looking at in the Darwin's finches. There's selection on beaks for feeding adaptations. And it's direct selection on feeding, but we've been arguing that sets indirect effects on the structure of the songs because of the way that birds use their beaks when they're singing. And for example, larger beaked birds that have evolved large beaks for applying high forces to crush heavy and hard seeds should be constrained in terms of how quickly they can open and close their beaks during sound production because of force velocity trade-offs. And when you see the production of certain kinds of songs, like very fast, quickly repeated songs, then you tend to see very rapid beak modulations. And so we think there are constraints that affect that. Liz Derryberry, who has recently joined the faculty here in Ecology and Evolution at UT Knoxville, has looked at this particular effect in a beautiful adaptive radiation in the neotropics of a bird group, the neotropical wood creepers, the dendrocolaptids. And she's found that as the beaks vary, so do the structure of the song, and it's a beautiful example of that. The structure of the sounds that an animal makes are also going to be affected by the perceptual capacities of the receivers. You're not going to evolve a communication signal along a line that cannot be detected, then it's not communication. That's almost sort of obvious. So if you don't have the capacity to detect the leaf-borne vibrations, then there's no way that that signal is going to evolve. Sometimes signal receivers are intended, other times they're not. So if you're a tungara frog and you're a male, you're trying to attract mates, you can also unintentionally attract bats that will eat you. That's the most famous example of this, I believe. And so that's going to also affect the structure of your calls, as Mike Ryan and collaborators have argued. Generically, the transmission properties of the environment are going to affect the structure of the sound. Haven Wiley in particular has made an argument that this is fundamental to the evolution of signals, that signals are propagation, acoustic signals are vibrations through some sort of medium, and the properties of that medium are going to vary with context. Most dramatically, we talk about differences between underwater and airborne communication, and there are huge differences there. But even within those media, there can be serious differences among different habitat types. So for example, the birdsong world has been obsessed with how sound might travel differently between wooded environments with lots of vibration and reverberation and absorption versus open environments with less of those sources of degradation, but more impact of wind and disruption of a signal. More precisely, you can have the structure of a signal that the bellbird sings, for example, might be influenced by other sources of sound in the environment. They might be snapping shrimp, in other words, noise, or sorry, not from the perspective of the snapping shrimp. Or it could be acoustic competition. And so, for example, Mario, my collaborator with the bellbirds, there's another very loud species that you find in this area, the screaming piha, which is a beautiful name. It screams, it's super loud too. And Mario thinks that they might be actually alternating when they call so as to not mask each other, so as to not drown each other out. And they might also be stratified into different parts of the environment in terms of altitude in order to avoid competition. I hadn't gotten to this yet, but this is maybe the main thing. These are sounds that animals are using to communicate with each other, and they have some sort of function. We often talk about it could be involved in competition, it could be involved in mate attraction, but there's other acoustic signals, other functions such as having communications within families, driven by kin selection. There could be effects of interspecies communication. Not so many examples of those, but when they occur, they're really pretty fascinating. So the structure of a signal can be driven by that. More precisely, behavioral context. So even within a species, within a sex, it could be that depending on the context, you're going to communicate and vocalize in different ways. So you might be amped up sometimes to communicate. Michael Reichert has shown this with frogs, that if you are positioned near a competitor, you're going to call differently. You can actually detect this acoustically than if you're in more of a sort of just a generic advertising situation. It's a little bit, I almost apologize for giving you this list because what I hope you're getting at is beginning to realize, oh my God, there is no simple explanation for the structure of a call. Truly, you have to be integrative in order to be able to try to understand this. You know, we look at the structure of call. It's kind of fun. It's enticing. It's captivating. You look at your computer screen, and there it is. You can take measures. You can get numbers on that sucker, and you can feel proud. But you have to backpedal and say, you know, where does this all come from? And it's from this laundry list. I've only got a dozen, so we're getting there. The structure of organisms can be influenced dramatically by genetic drift, and this is especially important when you're talking about between populations. If populations are isolated from one another, then just by random happenstance especially with low population numbers, and if they're isolated, then populations can diverge, and that can then affect a lot of things, especially like the mechanics of signal production and perception. In some cases, and these are cases that are near and dear to our heart, but they are not universal. Most species don't have this going on, but there is learning that can lead to cultural drift. So if you learn your call or your song, whatever it might be, then if you're isolated, there are groups that are isolated, they can begin to diverge, and not for anything meaningful, just sort of random happenstance. And this might be something going on with fin whales. You can also have learning leading to conformity, which won't so much lead to divergence. You can have processes that actually stop that from learning, from happening, and we see that in certain species. And sometimes learning will actually lead to divergence, not in random ways, but sometimes in ways that will discourage hybridization. And I think that might be the end of the list. You know, there might be more things I'm just sort of not remembering. Any mix of these can drive vocal divergence both between and within species. So I guess, again, the main point, we got to think about the biology. It's not just acoustics, it's bioacoustics. And we want to think about the biology that leads to the vocal phenotype, the acoustic phenotype. And then if we want to understand what causes the acoustic phenotype to diverge or to not, we need to look at the biology. 2 more slides. This is Philippe Coutinho of the Brazilian Seleção, the soccer team, scoring the winning goal against Costa Rica the other day to maintain the hopes and dreams of tens of millions of Brazilians. I just wanted to show that. It was a beautiful goal.